The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 22. They swarmed up towards Sherburne's house, a-whoopin' and ragin' like Injuns, and everything had to clear the way or get run over and tromped to mush, and it was awful to see. Children was heelin' it ahead of the mob, screamin' and tryin' to get out of the way, and every window along the road was full of women's heads, and there was nigger boys in every tree, and bucks and wenches looking over every fence, and as soon as the mob would get nearly to them, they would break and scattle back out of reach. Lots of the women and girls was crying and taking on, scared most to death. They swarmed up in front of Sherburne's palins as thick as they could jam together, and you couldn't hear yourself think for the noise. It was a little 20-foot yard. Some sung out, "Tear down the fence! Tear down the fence!" Then there was a racket of ripping and tearing and smashing, and down she goes, and the front wall of the crowd begins to roll in like a wave. Just then Sherburne steps out onto the roof of his little front porch with a double-barrel gun in his hand and takes his stand, perfectly calm and deliberate, not saying a word. The racket stopped, and the waves sucked back. Sherburne never said a word, just stood there looking down. The stillness was awful creepy and uncomfortable. Sherburne run his eyes slow along the crowd, and wherever it struck, the people tried a little to outgaze him, but they couldn't. They dropped their eyes and looked sneaky. Then, pretty soon, Sherburne sort of laughed. Not the pleasant kind, but the kind that makes you feel like when you were eating bread that's got sand in it. Then he says, slow and scornful, "The idea of you lynching anybody. It's amusing. The idea of you thinking you had pluck enough to lynch a man, because you're brave enough to tar and feather poor, friendless, cast-out women that come along here. Did that make you think you had grit enough to lay your hands on a man? Why, a man's safe in the hands of 10,000 of your kind, as long as it's daytime and you're not behind him. Do I know you? I know you clear through. Was born and raised in the South, and I've lived in the North, so I know the average all around. The average man's a coward. In the North, he lets anybody walk over him that wants to, and goes home and prays for a humble spirit to bear it. In the South, one man all by himself has stopped a stage full of men in the daytime and robbed the lot. Your newspapers call you a brave people, so much that you think you are braver than any other people, whereas you're just as brave, and no braver. Why don't your juries hang murderers? Because they're afraid the man's friends will shoot them in the back, in the dark, and it's just what they would do. So they always acquit, and then a man goes in the night with 100 masked cowards at his back and lynches the rascal. Your mistake is that you didn't bring a man with you. That's one mistake. And the other is that you didn't come in the dark and fetch your masks. You brought part of a man, Buck Harkness there, and if you hadn't had him to start you, you'd 'a' taken it out in blowing. You didn't want to come. The average man don't like trouble and danger. You don't like trouble and danger. But if only half a man, like Buck Harkness there, shouts, 'Lynch him, lynch him!' you're afraid to back down, afraid you'll be found out to be what you are. Cowards. And so you raise a yell and hang yourselves on to that half-a-man's coat-tail, and come raging up here swearing what big things you're going to do. The pitifullest thing out is a mob. That's what an army is, a mob. They don't fight with courage that's born in them, but with courage that's borrowed from their mass and from their officers. But a mob without any man at the head of it is beneath pitifulness. Now the thing for you to do is droop your tails and go home and crawl in a hole. If any real lynching's going to be done, it will be done in the dark, Southern fashion. And when they come, they'll bring their masks and fetch a man along. Now leave, and take your half-a-man with you," tossing his gun up across his left arm and cocking it when he says this. The crowd washed back sudden, and then broke all apart, and went tearing off every which way, and Buck Harkness, he heeled it after them, looking tolerable cheap. I could have stayed if I wanted to, but I didn't want to. I went to the circus and loafed around the backside till the watchman went by, and then dived in under the tent. I had my $20 gold piece and some other money, but I reckoned I'd better save it, 'cause there ain't no telling how soon you're going to need it, away from home and amongst strangers that way. You can't be too careful. I ain't opposed to spending money on circuses when there ain't no other way, but there ain't no use in wasting it on them. It was a real bully circus. It was the splendidest sight that ever was when they all come riding in, 2 and 2, a gentleman and lady side by side, the men just in their drawers and undershirts, and no shoes nor stirrups, and resting their hands on their thighs, easy and comfortable. There must have been 20 of 'em, and every lady with a lovely complexion, and perfectly beautiful, and looking just like a gang of real sure-enough queens, and dressed in clothes that cost millions of dollars, and just littered with diamonds. It was a powerful fine sight. I never see anything so lovely. And then one by one they got up and stood, and went a-weaving around the ring, so gentle and wavy and graceful, the men looking ever so tall and airy and straight, with their heads bobbing and skimming along, away up there under the tent roof, and every lady's rose-leafy dress flapping soft and silky round her hips, and she looking like the most loveliest parasol. And then faster and faster they went, all of them dancing, first one foot out in the air and then the other, the horses leaning more and more, and the ringmaster going round and round the center pole, cracking his whip and shouting, "Hi! Hi!" and the clown cracking jokes behind him. And by all hands dropped the reins, and every lady put her knuckles on her hips, and every gentleman folded his arms, and then how the horses did lean over and hump themselves. And so one after the other they all skipped off into the ring, and made the sweetest bow I ever see, and then scampered out, and everybody clapped their hands and went just about wild. Well, all through the circus they done the most astonishing things, and all the time that clown carried on so it most killed the people. The ringmaster couldn't ever say a word to him, but he was back at him quick as a wink with the funniest things a body ever said, and how he ever could think of so many of them, and so sudden and so pat, was what I couldn't no way understand. Why, I couldn't have thought of them in a year, and by, a drunk man tried to get into the ring, said he wanted to ride, said he could ride as well as anybody that ever was. They argued and tried to keep him out, but he wouldn't listen, and the whole show come to a standstill. Then the people begun to holler at him and make fun of him, and that made him mad, and he begun to rip and tear, so that stirred up the people, and a lot of men begun to pile down off of the benches and swarm towards the ring, saying, "Knock 'em down! Throw 'em out!" And 1 or 2 women begun to scream. So then the ringmaster he made a little speech and said he hoped there wouldn't be no disturbance, and if the man would promise he wouldn't make no more trouble, he would let him ride if he thought he could stay on the horse. So everybody laughed and said all right, and the man got on. The minute he was on, the horse begun to rip and tear and jump and cavort around, with 2 circus men hanging on to his bridle, trying to hold him, and the drunk man hanging on to his neck, and his heels flying in the air every jump, and the whole crowd of people standing up shouting and laughing till tears rolled down. And alas, sure enough, all the circus men could do, the horse broke loose, and away he went like the very nation, round and round the ring with that sot laying down on him and hanging to his neck, with first one leg hanging most to the ground on one side, and then the other one on the other side, and the people just crazy. It warn't funny to me, though. I was all of a tremble to see his danger. But pretty soon he struggled up a straddle and grabbed the bridle, a-reelin' this way and that, and the next minute he sprung up and dropped the bridle and stood, and the horse a-going like a house afire, too. He just stood up there, a-sailin' around as easy and comfortable as if he warn't ever drunk in his life, and then he begun to pull off his clothes and sling them. He shed them so thick they kind of clogged up the air, and altogether he shed 17 suits. And then there he was, slim and handsome and dressed the gaudiest and prettiest you ever saw. And he lit into that horse with his whip and made him fairly hum, and finally skipped off and made his bow and danced off to the dressing room, and everybody just a-howlin' with pleasure and astonishment. Then the ringmaster, he see how he'd been fooled, and he was the sickest ringmaster you ever see, I reckon. Why, it was one of his own men. He had got up that joke all out of his own head, and never let on to nobody. Well, I felt sheepish enough to be took in so, but I wouldn't have been in that ringmaster's place, not for $1,000. I don't know, there may be bullier circuses than what that one was, but I never struck them yet. Anyways, it was plenty good enough for me, and wherever I run across it, it can have all of my custom every time. Well, that night we had our show, but there warn't only about 12 people there, just enough to pay expenses, and they laughed all the time, and that made the Duke mad, and everybody left anyway before the show was over, but one boy, which was asleep. So the Duke said these Arkansas lunkheads couldn't come up to Shakespeare. What they wanted was low comedy, and maybe something ruther worse than low comedy, he reckoned. He said he could size their style. So next morning he got some big sheets of wrapping paper and some black paint and drawed off some handbills and stuck them up all over the village. The bills said, "At the courthouse! Exclamation! For 3 nights only! Exclamation! The world-renowned tragedians! David Garrick the Younger! Exclamation! And Edmund Kean the Elder! Exclamation! Of the London and Continental theatres, in their thrilling tragedy of the King's Camelopard, or the Royal Nonsuch! Exclamation! 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 Admission 50 cents. Then at the bottom was the biggest line of all, which said, "Ladies and children not admitted." "There," says he, "if that line don't fetch 'em, I don't know Arkansas." End of chapter 22. Chapter 23. Well, all day him and the king was hard at it, rigging up a stage and a curtain and a row of candles for footlights, and that night the house was jam full of men in no time. When the place couldn't hold no more, the Duke, he quit tending door and went around the back way and come onto the stage and stood up before the curtain and made a little speech and praised up this tragedy and said it was the most thrillingest one that ever was. And so he went on a-bragging about the tragedy, and about Edmund Kean the Elder, which was to play the main principal part in it. And at last, when he'd got everybody's expectations up high enough, he rolled up the curtain, and the next minute the king come a-prancing out on all fours, naked, and he was painted all over, rings streaked and striped all sorts of colors, as splendid as a rainbow. But never mind the rest of his outfit, it was just wild, but it was awful funny. The people most killed themselves laughing, and when the king got done caperin' and capered off behind the scenes, They roared and clapped and stormed and haw-hawed till he come back and done it over again, and after that they made him do it another time. Well, it would make a cow laugh to see the shines that old idiot cut. Then the Duke he lets the curtain down and bows to the people and says the great tragedy will be performed only 2 nights more, on accounts of pressin' London engagements, where the seats is all sold already for it in Drury Lane. And then he makes them another deep bow and says if he has succeeded in pleasing them and instructing them, he will be deeply obleeged if they will mention it to their friends and get them to come and see it. 20 people sings out, "What, is it over? Is that all?" The Duke says yes. Then there was a fine time. Everybody sings out, "Sold!" and rose up mad and was a-going for that stage and them tragedians. But a big, fine-looking man jumps up on a bench and shouts, "Hold on! Just a word, gentlemen!" They stop to listen. "We are sold, mighty badly sold, but we don't want to be the laughing-stock of this whole town, I reckon, and never hear the last of this thing as long as we live. No, what we want is to go out of here quiet and talk this show up and sell the rest of the town. Then we'll all be in the same boat. Ain't that sensible?" "You bet it is. The judge is right," everybody sings out. "All right, then. Not a word about any sell. Go along home and advise everybody to come and see the tragedy." Next day you couldn't hear nothing around that town but about how splendid that show was. House was jammed again that night, and we sold this crowd the same way. When me and the King and the Duke got home to the raft, we all had a supper, and by about midnight, they made Jim and me back her out and float her down the middle of the river and fetch her in and hide her about 2 miles below town. The 3rd night, the house was crammed again, and they warn't newcomers this time, but people that was at the show the other 2 nights. I stood by the Duke at the door, and I see that every man that went in had his pockets bulgin' or something muffled up under his coat, and I see it weren't no perfumery neither, not by a long sight. I smelt sickly eggs by the barrel, and rotten cabbages and such things, and if I know the signs of a dead cat being around, and I bet I do, there was 64 of them went in. I shoved in there for a minute, but it was too various for me. I couldn't stand it. Well, when the place couldn't hold no more people, the Duke, he give a fella a quarter and told him to tend door for a minute, and then he started around for the stage door, I after him. But the minute we turned the corner and was in the dark, he says, "Walk fast now, till you get away from the houses, and then shin for the raft like the dickens was after you." I done it, and he done the same. We struck the raft at the same time, and in less than 2 seconds we was gliding downstream, all dark and still, and edging towards the middle of the river, nobody saying a word. I reckon the poor king was in for a gaudy time of it with the audience, but nothing of the sort. Pretty soon he crawls out from under the wigwam and says, "Well, how'd the old thing pan out this time, Duke?" He hadn't been uptown at all. We never showed a light till we was about 10 mile below the village. Then we lit up and had a supper, and the King and the Duke fairly laughed their bones loose over the way they'd served them people. The Duke says, "Greenhorns, flatheads, I knew the first house would keep mum and let the rest of the town get roped in, and I knew they'd lay for us the 3rd night, and consider it was their turn now. Well, it is their turn, and I'd give something to know how much they'd take for it. I would just like to know how they're putting in their opportunity. They can turn it into a picnic if they want to. They brought plenty provisions." Them rapscallions took in $465 in that 3 nights. I never seen money hauled in by the wagon load like that before. By and by, when they was sleeping and snoring, Jim says, "Don't it surprise you, the way them kings carries on, Huck?" "No," I says, "it don't." Why don't it, Huck? Well, it don't because it's in the breed. I reckon they're all alike. But, Huck, these kings of ourn is reg'lar rapscallions. That's just what they is. They's reg'lar rapscallions. Well, that's what I'm a-sayin'. All kings is mostly rapscallions, as fur as I can make out. Is that so? You read about them once, you'll see. Look at Henry the Eighth. This'n is a Sunday school superintendent to him. And look at Charles Second, and Louis XIV, and Louis XV, and James Second, and Edward Second, and Richard Third, and 40 more, besides all them Saxton heptarchies that used to rip around so in old times and raise Cain. My, you ought to see old Henry the Eighth when he was in bloom. He was a blossom. He used to marry a new wife every day and chop off her head next morning, and he would do it just as indifferent as if he was ordering up eggs. Fetch up Nell Gwynn, he says. They fetch her up. Next morning, chop off her head, and they chop it off. Fetch up Jane Shore, he says, and up she comes. Next morning, chop off her head, and they chop it off. Ring up Fair Rosamond. Fair Rosamond answers the bell. Next morning, chop off her head. And he made every one of them tell him a tale every night, and he kept that up till he had hogged 1,001 tales that way, and then he put them all in a book, and called it Doomsday Book, which was a good name, and stated the case. You don't know kings, Jim, but I know them, and this old rip of ourn is one of the cleanest I've struck in history. Well, Henry, he takes a notion he wants to get up some trouble with this country. How does he go at it? Give notice? Give a country a show? No. All of a sudden, he heaves all the tea in Boston Harbor overboard and whacks out a Declaration of Independence and dares them to come on. That was his style. He never give anybody a chance. He had suspicions of his father, the Duke of Wellington. Well, what did he do? Ask him to show up? No. Drownded him in a butt of Mamsie, like a cat. Suppose people left money laying around where he was. What did he do? He collared it. Suppose he contracted to do a thing and you paid him and didn't sit down there and see that he done it. What did he do? He always done the other thing. Suppose he opened his mouth. What then? If he didn't shut it up powerful quick, he'd lose a lie every time. That's a kind of a bug, Henry was, and if we'd had him along 'stead of our kings, he'd have fooled that town a heap worse than ourn done. I don't say that ourn is lambs, because they ain't, when you come right down to the cold facts, but they ain't nothing to that old ram anyway. All I say is, kings is kings, and you got to make allowances. Take them all round, they're a mighty ornery lot. It's the way they're raised. But this one do smell so like donation, Huck. Well, they all do, Jim. We can't help the way a king smells. History don't tell no way. Now, the Duke, he's a tolerable likely man in some ways. Yes, a duke's different, but not very different. This one's a middlin' hard lot for a duke. When he's drunk, there ain't no nearsighted man could tell him from a king. Well, anyways, I don't hanker for no more in 'em, Huck. These is all I can stand. It's the way I feel too, Jim. But we've got them on our hands, and we got to remember what they are and make allowances. Sometimes I wish we could hear of a country that's out of kings. What was the use to tell Jim these warn't real kings and dukes? It wouldn't have done no good, and besides, it was just as I said. You couldn't tell them from the real kind. I went to sleep, and Jim didn't call me when it was my turn. He often done that. When I waked up, just at daybreak, he was sittin' there with his head down betwixt his knees, moanin' and mournin' to himself. I didn't take notice nor let on. I knowed what it was about. He was thinking about his wife and his children away up yonder, and he was low and homesick, because he hadn't ever been away from home before in his life, and I do believe he cared just as much for his people as white folks does for their'n. It don't seem natural, but I reckon it's so. He was often moaning and mourning that way nights when he judged I was asleep, and saying, "Po' little Elizabeth, po' little Johnny, it's mighty hard. I spec I ain't ever gwine to see you no mo', no mo'." He was a mighty good nigger, Jim was. But this time I somehow got to talking to him about his wife and young ones, and by he says, "What makes me feel so bad dis time is because I hear somepin over yonder on de bank like a whack or a slam, while ago, and it mind me er de time I treat my little Elizabeth so ornery. She warn't only 'bout 4 year old, and she took de scarlet fever, and had a powerful rough spell, but she got well, and one day she was a-standin' round, and I says to her, I says, 'Shut de door.' She never done it, just stood there, kinder smilin' up at me. It made me mad, and I says again, mighty loud, I says, 'Don't you hear me? Shut de door.' She just stood the same way, kinder smilin' up. I was a-bilin'. I says, 'I lay I make you mine.' And wid dat I fetch her a slap side de head dat sent her a-sprawlin'. Den I went into de other room, and is gone 'bout 10 minutes, and when I come back, dere was dat door standin' open yit, and dat child standin' most right in it, a-lookin' down and mournin', and de tears runnin' down. My, but I was mad. I was a-gwine for de child, but just den, it was a door dat opened innards. Just den, long come de wind and slam it to behind de child. Kerblam! And my land, de child never move. My breath most hop outer me, and I feel so, I don't know how I feel. I crope out all a-tremblin', and crope around and open de door easy and slow, and poke my head in behind de child, soft and still, and all of a sudden I says, "Pow!" just as loud as I could yell. She never budge. Oh, Huck, I bust out a-cryin' and grab her up in my arms and say, "Oh, de po' little thing. De Lord God Almighty forgive po' old Jim, 'cause he never goin' to forgive himself as long's he live." Oh, she was plumb deaf and dumb, Huck, plumb deaf and dumb, and I'd been a-treatin' her so. End of Chapter 23. Chapter 24. Next day, towards night, we laid up under a little willow towhead out in the middle, where there was a village on each side of the river, and the Duke and the King begun to lay out a plan for working them towns. Jim, he spoke to the Duke, and said he hoped it wouldn't take but a few hours, because it got mighty heavy and tiresome to him when he had to lay all day in the wigwam, tied with the rope. You see, when we left him all alone we had to tie him, because if anybody happened on to him all by himself, and not tied, it wouldn't look much like he was a runaway nigger, you know. So the Duke said it was kind of hard to have to lay roped all day, and he'd cipher out some way to get around it. He was uncommon bright, the Duke was, and he soon struck it. He dressed Jim up in the King Lear's outfit. It was a long curtain calico gown, and a white horsehair wig and whiskers, and then he took his theater paint and painted Jim's face and hands and ears and neck all over a dead, dull, solid blue, like a man that's been drownded 9 days. Blamed if he warn't the horriblest-looking outrage I ever see. Then the Duke took and wrote out a sign on a shingle, so, "Sick Arab, but harmless when not out of his head." And he nailed that shingle to a lath, and stood the lath up 4 or 5 foot in front of the wigwam. Jim was satisfied. He said it was a sight better than lying tied a couple of years every day, and trembling all over every time there was a sound. The Duke told him to make himself free and easy, and if anybody ever come meddling round, he must hop out of the wigwam and carry on a little, and fetch a howl or two like a wild beast, and he reckoned they would light out and leave him alone. Which was sound enough judgment, but you take the average man, and he wouldn't wait for him to howl. Why, he didn't only look like he was dead, he looked considerable more than that. These rapscallions wanted to try the Nonsuch again, because there was so much money in it, but they judged it wouldn't be safe, because maybe the news might have worked along down by this time. They couldn't hit no project that suited exactly, so at last the Duke said he reckoned he'd lay off and work his brains an hour or two and see if he couldn't put up something on the Arkansas village, and the king, he allowed he would drop over to the other village without any plan, but just trust in Providence to lead him the profitable way, meaning the devil, I reckon. We had all bought store clothes where we stopped last, and now the king put his'n on, and he told me to put mine on. I done it, of course. The king's duds was all black, and he did look real swell and starchy. I never knowed how clothes could change a body before. Why, before, he looked like the orneriest old rip that ever was. But now, when he'd take off his new white beaver and make a bow and do a smile, he looked that grand and good and pious that you'd say he had walked right out of the ark and maybe was old Leviticus himself. Jim cleaned up the canoe and I got my paddle ready. There's a big steamboat layin' at the shore way up under the point, about 3 mile above the town. Been there a couple of hours takin' on freight. Says the king, "See how I'm dressed? I reckon maybe I better arrive down from St. Louis or Cincinnati or some other big place. Go for the steamboat, Huckleberry. We'll come down to the village on her." I didn't have to be ordered twice to go and take a steamboat ride. I fetched the shore a half a mile above the village, and then went scooting along the bluff bank in the easy water. Pretty soon we come to a nice, innocent-looking young country Jake settin' on a log swabbing the sweat off of his face, for it was powerful warm weather, and he had a couple of big carpet-bags by him. "Run her nose in shore," says the king. I done it. "Where you bound for, young man?" "For the steamboat going to Orleans." "Get aboard," says the king. "Hold on a minute, my servant'll help you with them bags. Jump out and help the gentleman, Adolphus." Meaning me, I guess. I done so, and then we all three started on again. The young chap was mighty thankful, said it was tough work toting his baggage, such weather. He asked the king where he was going, and the king told him he'd come down the river and landed at the other village this morning, and now he was going up a few mile to see an old friend on a farm up there. The young fella says, "When I first see you, I says to myself, 'It's Mr. Wilkes, sure,' and he come mighty near getting here in time. But then I says, 'No, I reckon it ain't him, or else he wouldn't be paddling up the river.' You ain't him, are you?" "No, my name's Blodgett, Alexander Blodgett. Reverend Alexander Blodgett. I suppose I must say as I'm one of the Lord's poor servants, but still I'm just as able to be sorry for Mr. Wilkes for not arriving in time, all the same, if he's missed anything by it, which I hope he hasn't." "Well, he didn't miss any property by it, because he'll get that all right, but he's missed seeing his brother Peter die, which he mayn't mind, nobody can tell as to that, but his brother would have give anything in this world to see him before he died. Never talked about nothing else all these 3 weeks. Hadn't seen him since they was boys together. I hadn't seen his brother William at all. That's the deaf and dumb one. William ain't more than 30 or 35. Peter and George were the only ones that come out here. George was the married brother. Him and his wife both died last year. Harvey and William's the only ones that's left now, and as I was saying, they haven't got here in time." "Did anybody send 'em word?" "Oh, yes, a month or 2 ago, when Peter was first took, because Peter said then that he sorter felt like he warn't going to get well this time. You see, he was pretty old, and George's girls was too young to be much company for him, except Mary Jane, the red-headed one, and so he was kinder lonesome after George and his wife died, and didn't seem to care much to live. He most desperately wanted to see Harvey, and William too, for that matter, because he was one of them kind that can't bear to make a will. He left a letter behind for Harvey and said he'd told him in it where his money was hid, and how he wanted the rest of the property divided up so George's girls would be all right, for George didn't leave nothing. and that letter was all they could get him to put a pen to. Why do you reckon Harvey don't come? Where does he live? Oh, he lives in England. Sheffield, preaches there. Hasn't ever been in this country. He hasn't had any too much time. And besides, he mightn't have got the letter at all, you know. Too bad, too bad. He couldn't have lived to see his brothers, poor soul. You going to Orleans, you say? Yes, but that ain't only a part of it. I'm going in a ship next Wednesday for Rio Janeiro, where my uncle lives. It's a pretty long journey, but it'll be lovely. Wished I was a-going. Is Mary Jane the oldest? How old is the others? Mary Jane's 19, Susan's 15, and Joanna's about 14. That's the one that gives herself to good works and has a hare lip. Poor things, to be left alone in the cold world so. Well, they could be worse off. Old Peter had friends, and they ain't going to let them come to no harm. There's Hobson, the Baptist preacher, and Deacon Lot Hovey, and Ben Rucker, and Abner Shackleford, and Levi Bell, the lawyer, and Dr. Robinson, and their wives, and the widow Bartley, and, well, there's a lot of them, but these are the ones that Peter was thickest with, and used to write about sometimes when he wrote home. So Harvey'll know where to look for friends when he gets here. Well, the old man went on asking questions till he just fairly emptied that young fella. Blamed if he didn't inquire about everybody and everything in that blessed town, and all about the Wilkses, and about Peter's business, which was a tanner, and about George's, which was a carpenter, and about Harvey's, which was a dissenterin' minister, and so on and so on. Then he says, "What did you want to walk all the way up to the steamboat for?" "Because she's a big Orleans boat, and I was afeard she mightn't stop there. When they're deep, they won't stop for a hail. A Cincinnati boat will, but this is a St. Louis one." Was Peter Wilkes well off? Oh, yes, pretty well off. He had houses and land, and it's reckoned he left 3,000 or 4,000 in cash, hid up somewheres. When did you say he died? I didn't say, but it was last night. Funeral tomorrow, likely? Yes, about the middle of the day. Well, it's all terrible sad, but we've all got to go one time or another, so what we want to do is to be prepared. Then we're all right. Yes, sir, it's the best way. Ma used to always say that. When we struck the boat, she was about done loadin', and pretty soon she got off. The king never said nothing about going aboard, so I lost my ride after all. When the boat was gone, the king made me paddle up another mile to a lonesome place, and then he got ashore and says, "Now hustle back right off, and fetch the Duke up here, and the new carpet-bags, and if he's gone over to the other side, go over there and get him, and tell him to get himself up regardless. Shove along now." I see what he was up to, but I never said nothing, of course. When I got back with the Duke, we hid the canoe, and then they set down on a log, and the king told him everything, just like the young fella had said it, every last word of it. And all the time he was doing it, he tried to talk like an Englishman, and he done it pretty well, too, for a slouch. I can't imitate him, so I ain't a-going to try to, but he really done it pretty good. Then he says, "How were you on the deaf and dumb, Bilgewater?" The Duke said leave him alone for that, said he had played a deaf and dumb person before, on the histronic boards. So then they waited for a steamboat. About the middle of the afternoon a couple of little boats come along, but they didn't come from high enough up the river. But at last there was a big one, and they hailed her. She sent out for her yawl, and we went aboard. And she was from Cincinnati, and when they found we only wanted to go 4 or 5 miles, they was booming mad and gave us a cussin', and said they wouldn't land us. But the king was calm. He says, "If gentlemen can afford to pay $1 a mile apiece to be took on and put off in a yawl, a steamboat can afford to carry 'em, can't it?" So they softened down and said it was all right, and when we got to the village they yawled us ashore. About 24 men flocked down where they see the yawl a-comin', and when the king says, "Can any of you gentlemen tell me where Mr. Peter Wilkes lives?" They give a glance at one another, and nodded their heads, as much as to say, "What did I tell you?" Then one of them says, kind of soft and gentle, "I'm sorry, sir, but the best we can do is tell you where he did live yesterday evening." Sudden as winking, the ornery old creature went into smash and fell up against the man and put his chin on his shoulder and cried down his back and says, "Alas, alas, our poor brother gone, and we never got to see him. Oh, it's too hard." Then he turns around, blubbering, and makes a lot of idiotic signs to the Duke on his hands, and blamed if he didn't drop a carpet-bag and bust out a-crying. If they warn't the beatenest lot, them two frauds, that ever I struck. Well, the men gathered around and sympathized with them, and said all sorts of kind things to them, and carried their carpet-bags up the hill for them, and let them lean on them and cry, and told the king all about his brother's last moments, and the king, he told it all over again on his hands to the Duke, and both of them took on about that dead tanner like they'd lost the 12 disciples. Well, if ever I struck anything like it, I'm a nigger. It was enough to make a body ashamed of the human race. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25. The news was all over town in 2 minutes, and you could see the people tearing down on the run from every which way, some of them putting on their coats as they come. Pretty soon we was in the middle of a crowd, and the noise of the trampin' was like a soldier march. The windows and dooryards was full, and every minute somebody would say over a fence, "Is it them?" And somebody trotting along with the gang would answer back and say, "You bet it is." When we got to the house, the street in front of it was packed, and the 3 girls was standing in the door. Mary Jane was red-headed, but that don't make no difference. She was most awful beautiful, and her face and her eyes was all lit up like glory, she was so glad her uncles had come. The king, he spread his arms, and Mary Jane, she jumped for them, and the hare-lip jumped for the Duke, and there they had it. Everybody most, leastways women, cried for joy to see them meet again at last and have such good times. Then the king, he hunched the Duke private. I see him do it. And then he looked around and see the coffin over in the corner on 2 chairs. So then him and the Duke, with a hand across each other's shoulder and the other hand to their eyes, walked slow and solemn over there, everybody dropping back to give them room, and all the talk and noise stopping, people saying, "Shh," and all the men taking their hats off and drooping their heads so you could 'a' heard a pin fall. And when they got there, they bent over and looked in the coffin and took one sight, and then they bust out a-crying so you could 'a' heard them to Orleans most, and then they put their arms round each other's necks and hung their chins over each other's shoulders, and then for 3 minutes, or maybe 4, I never see 2 men leak the way they done. And mind you, everybody was doing the same, and the place was that damp I never see anything like it. Then one of them got on one side of the coffin, and the other on the other side, and they kneeled down and rested their foreheads on the coffin, and let on to pray all to themselves. Well, when it come to that, it worked the crowd like you never see anything like it, and everybody broke down and went to sobbing right out loud. The poor girls, too, and every woman nearly went up to the girls without saying a word and kissed them, solemn on the forehead, and then put their hand on their head and looked up towards the sky with the tears running down, and then busted out and went off sobbing and swabbing, and give the next woman a show. I never see anything so disgusting. Well, by and by, the king, he gets up and comes forward a little, and works himself up and slobbers out a speech all full of tears and flapdoodle about its being a sore trial for him and his poor brother to lose the diseased, and to miss seeing diseased alive after the long journey of 4,000 mile, but it's a trial that's sweetened and sanctified to us by this dear sympathy and these holy tears, and so he thanks them out of his heart and out of his brother's heart, because out of their mouths they can't, words being too weak and cold, and all that kind of rotten slush, till it was just sickening. and then he blubbers out a pious goody-goody amen, and turns himself loose and goes to crying fit to bust. And the minute the words were out of his mouth, somebody over in the crowd struck up the doxologer, and everybody joined in with all their might, and it just warmed you up and made you feel as good as church letting out. Music is a good thing, and after all that soul butter and hogwash, I never see it freshen up things so, and sound so honest and bully. Then the king begins to work his jaw again, and says how him and his nieces would be glad if a few of the main principal friends of the family would take supper here with them this evening, and help set up with the ashes of the deceased, and says if his poor brother layin' yonder could speak, he knows who he would name, for they was names that was very dear to him, and mentioned often in his letters, and so he will name the same, to wit, as follows, viz., Reverend Mr. Hobson, and Deacon Lot Hovey, and Mr. Ben Rucker, and Abner Shackelford, and Levi Bell, and Dr. Robinson, and their wives, and the widow Bartley. Reverend Hobson and Dr. Robinson was down to the end of the town a-hunting together. That is, the doctor was shipping a sick man to the other world, and the preacher was p'inting him right. Lawyer Bell was away up to Louisville on business, but the rest was on hand, so they all come and shook hands with the king and thanked him and talked to him, and then they shook hands with the Duke and didn't say nothing, but just kept a-smiling and bobbing their heads like a passel of sapheads, whilst he made all sorts of signs with his hands and said goo-goo, goo-goo-goo all the time, like a baby that can't talk. So the king, he blattered on and managed to inquire about pretty much everybody and dog in town by his name, and mentioned all sorts of little things that happened one time or another in the town, or to George's family, or to Peter, and he always let on that Peter wrote him the things, but that was a lie. He got every blessed one of them out of that young flathead that we canoed up to the steamboat. Then Mary Jane, she fetched the letter her father left behind, and the king, he read it out loud and cried over it. It give the dwellin'-house and $3,000 gold to the girls, and it give the tan-yard, which was doing a good business, along with some other houses and land, worth about $7,000, and $3,000 in gold to Harvey and William, and told where the $6,000 cash was hid down cellar. So these two frauds said they'd go and fetch it up and have everything square and above board, and told me to come with a candle. We shut the cellar door behind us, and when they found the bag, they spilt it out on the floor, and it was a lovely sight, all them yaller boys. My, the way the king's eyes did shine! He slaps the Duke on the shoulder and says, "Oh, this ain't bully nor nothing. Oh, no, I reckon not. Why, Billy, it beats the Nonsuch, don't it?" The Duke allowed it did. They pawed the yaller boys, and sifted them through their fingers and let them jingle down on the floor, and the king says, "It ain't no use talking, being brothers to a rich dead man, and representatives of furrin heirs that's got left is the line for you and me, Bilge. This yer comes a trustin' to Providence. It's the best way in the long run. I've tried 'em all, and there ain't no better way." Most everybody would have been satisfied with the pile and took it on trust, but no, they must count it. So they counts it, and it comes out $415 short. Says the king, "Darn him, I wonder what he done with that $415. They worried over that a while and ransacked all around for it. Then the Duke says, "Well, he was a pretty sick man, and likely he made a mistake. I reckon that's the way of it. The best way is to let it go and keep still about it. We can spare it." "Oh, shucks, yes, we can spare it. I don't care nothing about that. It's the count I'm thinking about. We want to be awful square and open and above board here, you know. We want to lug this here money upstairs and count it before everybody. Then there ain't nothing suspicious. But when the dead man says there's $6,000, you know we don't want to—" "Hold on," says the Duke. "Let's make up the deficit." And he begun to haul out yeller boys out of his pocket. "It's a most amazing idea, Duke. You have got a rattling clever head on you," says the king. "Blest if the old Nonsuch ain't a-helping us out again." And he begun to haul out yeller jackets and stack them up. It most busted them, but they made up the 6,000 clean and clear. "Say," says the Duke, "I got another idea. Let's go upstairs and count this money, and then take and give it to the girls." "Good land, Duke, let me hug you. It's the most dazzling idea 'at ever a man struck. You have certainly got the most astonishing head I ever see. Oh, this is the boss dodge, there ain't no mistake about it. Let 'em fetch along their suspicions now if they want to. This'll lay 'em out." When we got upstairs, everybody gathered around the table, and the king he counted it and stacked it up, $300 in a pile, 20 elegant little piles. Everybody looked hungry at it and licked their chops. Then they raked it into the bag again, and I see the king begin to swell himself up for another speech. He says, "Friends all, my poor brother that lays yonder has done generous by them that's left behind in the Vale of Sorrers. He has done generous by these your poor little lambs that he loved and sheltered, and that's left fatherless and motherless. Yes, and we that knowed him knows that he would have done more generous by 'em if he hadn't been afeard of wounding his dear William and me. Now, wouldn't he? There ain't no question about it in my mind. Well, then, what kind of brothers would it be that'd stand in his way at such a time? And what kind of uncles would it be that'd rob, yes, rob such poor sweet lambs as these that he loved at such a time? If I know William, and I think I do, well, I'll just ask him." He turns around and begins to make a lot of signs to the Duke with his hands, and the Duke he looks at him stupid and leather-headed a while. Then all of a sudden he seems to catch his meaning, and jumps for the king, goo-gooing with all his might for joy, and hugs him about 15 times before he lets up. Then the king says, "I knowed it. I reckon that'll convince anybody the way he feels about it. Here, Mary Jane, Susan, Joanna, take the money. Take it all. It's the gift of him that lays yonder, cold but joyful." Mary Jane, she went for him. Susan and the harelip went for the Duke, and then such another hugging and kissing I never see yet. And everybody crowded up with the tears in their eyes, and most shook the hands off of them frauds, saying all the time, "You dear good souls, how lovely! How could you?" Well, then, pretty soon all hands got to talking about the disease again, and how good he was, and what a loss he was, and all that. And before long, a big iron-jawed man worked himself in there from outside, and stood a-listening and looking, and not saying anything, and nobody saying anything to him either, because the king was talking, and they was all busy listening. The king was saying, in the middle of something he'd started in on, "Them being particular friends of the diseased, that's why they're invited here this evening, but tomorrow we want all to come, everybody, for he respected everybody, he liked everybody, and so it's fitting that his funeral orgies should be public." And so he went on a-mooning on and on, liking to hear himself talk, and every little while he fetching his funeral orgies again, till the Duke he couldn't stand it no more, so he writes on a little scrap of paper, "Obsequies, you old fool," and folds it up and goes to goo-gooing and reaching it over people's heads to him. The king reads it and puts it in his pocket and says, "Poor William, afflicted as he is, his heart's all is right. Asked me to invite everybody to come to the funeral, wants me to make 'em all welcome, but he needn't 'a' worried, it was just what I was at." Then he weaves along again, perfectly calm, and goes to dropping in his funeral orgies again every now and then, just like he done before. But when he done it the third time, he says, "I say orgies, not because it's the common term, because it ain't, obsequies being the common term, but because orgies is the right term. Obsequies ain't used in England no more now, it's gone out. We say orgies now in England. Orgies is better because it means the thing you're after more exact. It's a word that's made up out in the Greek orgo, outside, open, abroad, and the Hebrew jesum, to plant, cover up, hence inter. So, you see, funeral orgies is an open or public funeral." He was the worst I ever struck. Well, the iron-jawed man, he laughed right in his face. Everybody was shocked. Everybody says, "Why, Doctor!" And Abner Shackelford says, "Why, Robinson, hain't you heard the news? This is Harvey Wilkes." The king, he smiled eager, and shoved out his flapper, and says, "Is it my poor brother's dear good friend and physician? "Keep your hands off of me," says the doctor. "You talk like an Englishman, don't you? It's the worst imitation I ever heard. You Peter Wilkes's brother. You're a fraud, that's what you are." Well, how they all took on! They crowded around the doctor and tried to quiet him down, and tried to explain to him and tell him how Harvey showed in 40 ways that he was Harvey, and knowed everybody by name, and the names of the very dogs, and begged him not to hurt Harvey's feelings, and the poor girl's feelings and all that. But it warn't no use. He stormed right along and said any man that pretended to be an Englishman and couldn't imitate the lingo no better than what he did was a fraud and a liar. The poor girls was hanging to the king and crying, and all of a sudden the doctor ups and turns on them. He says, "I was your father's friend, and I'm your friend, and I warn you as a friend and an honest one that wants to protect you and keep you out of harm and trouble, to turn your backs on that scoundrel and have nothing to do with him, the ignorant tramp, with his idiotic Greek and Hebrew, as he calls it. He is the thinnest kind of an impostor. He has come here with a lot of empty names and facts which he picked up somewheres, and you take them for proofs, and are helped to fool yourselves by these foolish friends here, who ought to know better. Mary Jane Wilkes, you know me for your friend, and for your unselfish friend, too. Now listen to me. Turn this pitiful rascal out. I beg you to do it. Will you?" Mary Jane straightened herself up, and my, but she was handsome. She says, "Here is my answer." She hove up the bag of money and put it in the king's hands and says, "Take the $6,000 and invest for me and my sisters any way you want to, and don't give us no receipt for it." Then she put her arm around the king on one side, and Susan and the hare-lip done the same on the other. Everybody clapped their hands and stomped on the floor like a perfect storm, whilst the king held up his head and smiled proud. The doctor says, "All right, I wash my hands of the matter, but I warn you all that a time's coming when you're going to feel sick whenever you think of this day." And away he went. "All right, doctor," says the king, kinder mocking him. "We'll try and get him to send for you," which made them all laugh, and they said it was a prime good hit. End of chapter 25.